The silence was the most expensive thing in the ballroom, a profound quiet that cost more than the thousands of white roses entwined on gilded arches. Within the Celestial Peaks Hotel, a universe of opulence Julian Croft had meticulously built, tonight's stillness was a profound failure. Crystal chandeliers, each a constellation of captured light, rained a soft glow upon tables, set for a celebration that would never happen. Gold-rimmed china gleamed expectantly. Fine linen napkins were folded into perfect swans, and the air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken tension, held its breath. It was a cathedral consecrated for a wedding, now transformed into a beautiful, heartbreaking tomb of what should have been, a monument to a promise broken just hours before its dawn dot. Through this silent monument walked its architect, Julian Croft, himself, his presence a stark, moving shadow in the sea of white and gold. His tailored suit was the color of a midnight sky, a perfect armor that hinted at the disciplined, athletic form beneath. His footsteps were measured, precise clicks on the marble floor, the only sound to challenge the oppressive hush. His handsome features were carved from stone, a mask of stern control that betrayed nothing of the man within. He moved with an air of absolute authority, his deep gray eyes sweeping the room, not with pride, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a general surveying a flawless, yet utterly useless, fortress. This fortress of luxury was Julian's life's work, and his gilded cage. He was the city's preeminent creator of fairy tales for others, the man who built the stages for life's most joyous moments. Yet he was a man who had long since ceased to believe in them for himself, a ghost haunting his own masterpiece. Years ago, a brutal betrayal had shattered his heart. When the woman he was to marry left him for his closest friend, taking with her his trust and his faith in anything lasting. Now, his success was a wall built around that hollow space, each new hotel a new stone, each award a layer of mortar to keep the world out, and the loneliness in. The spell of his solitary inspection was broken by the hesitant approach of his head of events, a young woman whose usual confidence had evaporated. She held a tablet like a shield, her voice barely a whisper as she confirmed the inevitable financial fallout of the evening's disaster. "The Vance-Hamilton wedding, sir," she began, her eyes darting nervously. "It is officially canceled. All services." Julian's jaw tightened, but not with surprise. It was the next piece of information that truly snagged his attention. "The problem, sir," she continued, "is the bride. Miss Vance. She is in the private garden and she is refusing to leave the premises." For Julian, this was an unacceptable breach of protocol, a loose thread in his perfectly woven tapestry of control and discretion. A canceled wedding was a financial matter, easily managed with contracts and clauses. A distraught woman making a scene in his exclusive establishment was a liability, a potential stain on the pristine reputation he guarded so ferociously. Annoyance, cold and sharp, cut through his weariness. This was a situation that required not sensitivity, but efficiency. He dismissed his subordinate with a curt nod, his mind already turning to the hotel's security team, his intent clear: to have the woman escorted out quietly and swiftly before she became a problem he couldn't contain. He strode from the artificial perfection of the ballroom into the cool, authentic air of the night. The private garden was a sanctuary of its own, a space of sculpted hedges and the gentle music of a stone fountain. The city lights twinkled far below, a distant, glittering ocean. He expected to find hysterics, the messy, theatrical sobbing of a woman wronged, a scene he had no patience or desire to witness. He prepared his words, a cold, impersonal script designed to quell any emotional outburst and expedite her departure. He was not a counselor. He was the owner, and this was his property. His domain was one of order, and she was an element of chaos. But the woman he found on the stone bench was not chaos. She was a portrait of heartbreaking stillness, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. She wore a simple white silk robe, a stark contrast to the grand wedding gown that now lay abandoned. Her hair and makeup, so flawlessly applied for a rehearsal dinner that had marked the end of her world, framed a face of stunning, quiet sorrow. She wasn't crying, not in the way he had anticipated. She was simply sitting there, her gaze fixed on the gentle play of water in the fountain, as if it held the answers to questions she couldn't yet form. Her grace, even in this moment of utter devastation, was a silent, powerful rebuke to his cynical expectations. He deliberately let his leather shoes scrape against the stone path, a sound meant to startle, to announce the arrival of authority. She didn't flinch. He drew closer, standing over her, a tall, imposing figure ready to deliver his verdict. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of the storm raging within her. He saw her most striking feature up close, her eyes, a warm hazel that should have been sparkling with joy, now clouded with a depth of disbelief and pain that was profoundly unsettling. He felt an unwelcome flicker of something other than impatience, a ghost of an emotion he had buried long ago. He immediately crushed it. Clearing his throat, he let the cold, rehearsed words fall into the fragile silence between them. "I'm sorry," he said, the apology a hollow formality. "But the hotel is closing for the evening. You need to leave the premises now." The words were as sharp and unyielding as he intended. For a long moment she didn't respond, and he braced himself for the tears, the pleading. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked up at him. Her gaze was not one of anger or defiance. It was clear, direct, and held the full, crushing weight of her shattered heart. The world seemed to pause, held captive by that single quiet glance. Then, she spoke, her voice soft but not weak, a melodic sound fractured by sorrow. It was not the plea he expected, nor the argument he was prepared for. Instead, her words were a poetic surrender, a statement so full of dignified pain that it pierced straight through the armor around his heart. "I'm sorry for the trouble," she said, her hazel eyes holding his. "I just needed to see the stars one last time before my world went completely dark." The sentence hung in the cool night air, an arrow of pure, unvarnished truth. And in that instant, Julian Croft, the man who controlled everything, felt his carefully constructed world begin to tilt on its axis. Julian's world, a realm governed by logic, schedules, and impenetrable emotional fortitude, fractured in the space of a single heartbeat. Her words, so devoid of artifice, landed not as a plea, but as a statement of profound truth, a quiet epitaph for a life that had just ended. "Before my world went completely dark." The phrase echoed in the vast, silent chambers of his own past, striking a chord of memory he thought had long since rusted into silence. He had built an empire of stone and steel to ensure he would never feel that darkness again. Yet here was this stranger, this woman in a silk robe, articulating the very sensation he had spent a decade burying. He found he could not move, could not speak, his entire being arrested by a jarring, unwelcome, and undeniable sense of recognition. All his carefully laid plans for the next 60 seconds evaporated into the cool night air. The call to security, the firm but polite escort from the premises, the restoration of perfect, sterile order, it all seemed like a script from another lifetime. The annoyance he had cultivated on his walk to the garden now felt like a cheap, flimsy shield against this sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a logistical problem or a potential liability, but as a person suspended in the epicenter of a personal cataclysm. The first hairline crack appeared in the fortress walls around his heart, and through it, a sliver of forgotten warmth began to seep in. Without conscious thought, his body made a decision his mind was still struggling to comprehend. He turned, not towards the exit, but towards the empty space on the stone bench. He crossed the small distance and sat on the opposite end, the cold stone a grounding reality in a moment that felt surreal. The gesture was simple, yet it was a monumental concession, a silent offering of truce. The space between them, once a chasm of authority and vulnerability, was now charged with a new, fragile energy. The garden was no longer his property, and she the trespasser. It was a shared, quiet space, a sanctuary for two lonely souls under a canopy of indifferent stars. The scent of night-blooming jasmine seemed to deepen, a fragrance of unexpected solace. He broke the profound silence that had fallen between them. But the words that emerged were not his own. They felt foreign on his tongue, stripped of their usual cold precision. He did not offer the empty platitude society prescribed for such moments. There was no, "I'm sure it will be all right," or "you'll get through this." Instead, he offered something far more valuable, a genuine inquiry, a key to a door he himself had long since bolted shut. What happened? The question was quiet, barely, disturbing the air, yet it landed with the weight of true curiosity. It was an invitation, not a demand. A moment of vulnerability from a man who despised the very concept of it. Elara flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound of his voice, the softness of it a stark contrast to his earlier command. She had braced herself for another dismissal, another wave of harsh reality. This gentle question caught her completely off guard. She slowly lifted her gaze from the fountain and looked out towards the glittering expanse of the city below, a universe of lives. Continuing on, oblivious to the implosion of her own, she took a deep, shuddering breath, the first visible crack in the dam of her composure. When she spoke, her voice was a low whisper, recounting the brutal efficiency of her heartbreak, not with anger, but with the hollow tone of surreal disbelief. A life built over 5 years, dismantled by a few dozen words on a glowing screen. Julian listened. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't just hear the words, he truly listened to the pain behind them. He heard the story of shared dreams, of a dress hanging in a closet, of parents flying in from across the country, of a future so vividly imagined it felt like a memory. And then he heard of its executioner, a text message, a confession of love for another, the cowardly admission that he was already on his way to the airport. Each detail was a ghost from his own past, the same brutal narrative of betrayal rewritten on the heart of another. He remained perfectly still, a statue of quiet attention, letting her story wash over him, recognizing the familiar, agonizing tide. As she spoke, his own memories rose unbidden from the depths. He remembered the sickening shock, the public humiliation, the all-consuming rage that had fueled him for years. That rage had been his building material. It had laid the foundation of his empire and frozen the core of his heart into a permanent winter. But as he looked at Elara, he saw no rage. He saw a profound, graceful sorrow, a quiet dignity in the face of absolute devastation. There was a strength in her quietness that his fury had never possessed. He was looking at a mirror of his own past, but the reflection staring back was purer, kinder, and infinitely more resilient in spirit. The realization settled upon him with the force of a revelation. The emotion stirring within him wasn't pity. It was a deep, unsettling, and powerful sense of admiration. He saw the person he could have been if he hadn't allowed his own heartbreak to curdle into a shield of cynical detachment. In her, the light of empathy had not been extinguished by the darkness of betrayal. An instinct he hadn't felt in a decade, fierce and fiercely protective, surged within him. He felt a sudden, overwhelming need to shield that small, resilient flame from the harsh winds of the world, to give it a safe place to flicker and, perhaps, to one day burn brightly again. He stood, the sudden movement causing her to trail off, her story left hanging in the air. Elara looked up, her tear-filled eyes laced with confusion, assuming this was the end, the final dismissal. But Julian's expression was no longer cold or impatient. It was etched with a complex, unreadable resolve. He looked down at her, a stranger who felt more familiar to him than anyone he had known in years, and he made a decision that defied all logic, all protocol, all the rules by which he lived his life. "The presidential suite," he said, his voice firm, yet imbued with a new, quiet authority. "It's on the top floor, my personal penthouse. It's empty." He let the words settle, watching as confusion warred with disbelief on her face. He offered no complex explanation, only a simple, undeniable command that felt more like a plea. "The suite is yours," he stated, leaving no room for argument. "You can stay for as long as you need to. No one will bother you." Internally, he knew this was madness, letting a stranger into the most private part of his world. But as he looked at her, he understood his own motive with perfect clarity. He wasn't just offering a room, he was offering sanctuary to the kind of grace he thought no longer existed in the world, the kind he had lost in himself. Elara stared at the man before her, his impossible offer hanging in the cool night air like a phantom. The presidential suite, his personal penthouse. The words made no sense, a language from a world she no longer inhabited. Her mind, already a fractured landscape of shock and betrayal, could not process this gesture. Kindness from a stranger was a concept she was no longer equipped to believe in. She saw it as a trick of the light, a cruel joke, or worse, some form of transactional pity she couldn't possibly accept. Her first instinct, a reflex born of shattered trust, was to refuse, to pull the remnants of her dignity around her like a shield and walk away to anywhere but here. But Julian Croft was not a man accustomed to having his decisions questioned. As if sensing her internal retreat, he acted with a swift, decisive finality that left no room for debate. He drew his phone from his inner pocket, the screen illuminating his severe features. His thumb moved with practiced efficiency as he dialed a number. His voice, when he spoke, was the epitome of command, a low, authoritative tone that sliced through the night's quiet. "Anya," he said, "prepare the penthouse, immediately. My guest, Miss Vance, will be staying indefinitely. Grant her Level 1 clearance and ensure her privacy is absolute. I will brook no interruptions and no questions." Listening to his clipped commands, Elara felt the last of her resistance crumble. The sheer, effortless power he wielded was a force of nature, a gravitational pull that bent the world to his will. In her current state of utter powerlessness, to be caught in such an orbit was both terrifying and, to her surprise, strangely comforting. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had nowhere to go, no strength left to argue. Her own hotel room, filled with the ghosts of a future that had just died, was unthinkable. This cold, powerful man was offering a sterile, anonymous sanctuary, and it was a lifeline she was simply too tired to refuse. A single, almost imperceptible nod was her only answer. The journey to the penthouse was a study in silence. Julian led the way, his back a rigid wall of bespoke fabric, setting a pace that was neither rushed nor leisurely. They moved from the organic, moonlit quiet of the garden back into the calculated opulence of the hotel's private corridors. He guided her to a sleek, unmarked elevator, activated only by a private key card he produced from his wallet. As the polished steel doors slid shut, the small enclosed space amplified the tension between them. He stood in one corner, she the other, two strangers connected only by the shared geography of heartbreak, and this single, impulsive act that defied all reason. The elevator doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into the heart of the suite itself, and Elara's breath caught in her throat. The space was immense, a palace in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living area, revealing a breathtaking 180-degree panorama of the sleeping city below. The decor was a symphony of minimalist luxury, all cool tones of charcoal gray, polished, chrome, and deep, unforgiving black. It was a masterpiece of design, stunningly beautiful, meticulously ordered, and utterly devoid of warmth. There were no photographs, no books left open, no sign of life. It was a museum of success, a perfect gleaming reflection of the man who stood beside her dot. Hesitantly, Elara stepped onto the plush, dark carpet, feeling like a ghost trespassing in a world she was never meant to see. The sheer scale of the loneliness in the room was overwhelming. The air was cool and still, carrying only the faint, clean scent of something expensive and antiseptic. Drawn by the sea of lights below, she moved towards the vast expanse of glass, pressing a trembling hand against its cool, solid surface. The city, which had felt so mocking from the garden, now seemed distant and unreal, a beautiful pattern of scattered jewels. From this height, she felt a profound sense of detachment, a temporary reprieve from the crushing gravity of her new reality. Julian remained by the elevator, watching her. He saw her small, fragile form, clad in a simple silk robe, silhouetted. Against the glittering skyline his ambition had conquered. And in that moment, the full weight of his impulsive act crashed down upon him. This space was his sanctum sanctorum, the one place on earth where he was completely and utterly alone, shielded from the messy unpredictability of the world. By bringing her here, he had not just offered shelter, he had willingly breached his own final line of defense. A surge of pure, primal panic rose in his chest. This woman, with her quiet, graceful sorrow, was the most dangerous variable to enter his controlled universe in over a decade. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room, and sought refuge in the familiar language of logistics. "The kitchen is through there," he said, his voice a formal, detached instrument, gesturing towards a gleaming steel door. "It is fully stocked. The security panel is by the entrance. The concierge can be reached with the touch of a button on the console. They can arrange for anything you need, clothes, food, anything. Your privacy will be respected." He was building walls of instruction and protocol around the raw, emotional core of his decision, desperate to reframe this deeply personal act as a simple, impersonal transaction. Elara turned from the window, her face pale and ethereal in the soft, indirect lighting of the suite. She looked at him, this formidable stranger, this architect of gilded cages, and her gaze held no fear, only a profound, weary understanding. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady, a fragile thread of strength in the vast, empty space. "Thank you," she said, the words simple and direct. "Thank you, Mr. Croft." The use of his formal name was a quiet acknowledgement of the chasm between their worlds, a necessary boundary that for a moment they both desperately needed. It framed her not as a victim, but as a guest, however extraordinary the circumstances. Julian gave a curt single nod in response, his businesslike mask firmly back in place. Anything more would be a concession to the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Rest," he commanded softly, the word an order, not a suggestion. He turned and stepped back into the elevator without another word, the steel doors sliding shut with a quiet, definitive hiss. Elara was left standing alone in the breathtaking, silent expanse of the penthouse. This quiet was different from the one in the ballroom below. It was not heavy with loss, but expansive with a terrifying, unknown potential. Safe and hidden, she was now completely, utterly alone, and for the first time since the world had ended, she allowed a single, hot tear to fall. Alone in the silent, cavernous suite, the single tear that had traced a path down Elara's cheek became a floodgate, The profound shock that had held her in a state of suspended animation for hours finally gave way, and the full, crushing weight of her reality descended upon her. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged, and she sank to the plush charcoal carpet, her body curling into itself as if to withstand a physical blow. The magnificent city view, a testament to power and beauty, blurred into a meaningless smear of weeping lights. Here, in this gilded cage so far above the world, she was finally safe enough to completely and utterly fall apart. The sound of her own heartbreak, the only thing to fill the vast, lonely space. Meanwhile, the private elevator descended, carrying Julian away from the chaos he had just invited into his life. With each floor he passed, he felt as though he were sinking deeper into an unfamiliar sea, the pressure building around him. He bypassed the main lobby, exiting into the sterile, fluorescent-lit service corridors, needing to be unseen, to retreat into the shadows of his own hotel. A chaotic, unfamiliar rhythm pounded in his chest, a wildness he could not tame. He, a man whose entire existence was a monument to rational thought and emotional control, had just committed the single most illogical, impulsive act of his adult life, and he was terrified. Amidst the storm of her own tears, Elara's thoughts became a maelstrom of memories, each one a fresh wave of pain. 5 years of laughter, of shared secrets whispered in the dark, of promises that had seemed as solid as the ground beneath her feet, all now replayed in her mind as scenes from a cruel, elaborate fiction. She fumbled for her phone, the screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. She saw the text message again, the final brutal words that had detonated her world. And below it, a long list of missed calls from her mother, her father, her maid of honor, each one a small icon of the concern and confusion she had unleashed upon the people she loved most. Julian retreated to his office, a sanctuary of leather, dark wood, and controlled silence. His instinct was to exorcise the foreign emotion by immersing himself in the cold, hard certainty of his work. He pulled up spreadsheets, acquisition reports, profit and loss statements, the familiar language of his kingdom. But the numbers and figures refused to cohere. They swam before his eyes, meaningless symbols on a screen. The only image his mind could conjure was the face of the woman in his penthouse, her hazel eyes clouded with a sorrow so profound it felt ancient. Her quiet, poetic words, "Before my world went completely dark," echoed louder than any market projection, rendering his empire of logic completely powerless. After the tempest of grief had passed, leaving her hollowed out and exhausted, Elara slowly pushed herself up from the floor. She moved through the silent, perfect rooms, a ghost in someone else's life. As the initial shock subsided, a new feeling began to surface, one that was so intrinsically her, a profound, aching empathy. Her thoughts shifted from the pain inflicted upon her to the chaos she had left in her wake. She thought of her parents, who had flown thousands of miles, their hearts full of joy, now surely sick with worry. She thought of the hotel staff, the chefs, the florists, the musicians, all the lives and plans disrupted by this personal cataclysm. This unwelcome empathy was the very thing Julian was fighting in his office. He paced the floor, relentlessly cross-examining his own motives, desperate to categorize his actions in a way that made sense. Was it pity? He recoiled from the thought, for he held pity in the utmost contempt. Was it a calculated business decision, a way to quietly contain a potentially messy public relations issue? The excuse felt thin, a lie he told himself to mask a much more terrifying truth. This wasn't business, it was personal. He had seen his own ancient wound reflected in her eyes, but he had also seen a grace he'd never possessed. Protecting her felt, in some terrifying, illogical way, like he was trying to save a part of himself he had long ago abandoned. Her exploration led her to the kitchen. a marvel of untouched stainless steel and gleaming marble. She opened the refrigerator and found it perfectly organized, stocked with gourmet cheeses, artisanal breads, and rows of pristine bottled water. It was the kind of impersonal, efficient care that money could buy, a thoughtfulness devoid of any actual thought. Yet, in her state of utter desolation, it felt like a kindness. On the vast marble island, a single small object had been left. A simple leather-bound notepad and a heavy, expensive-looking pen. In the sterile perfection of the suite, it was the one thing that felt human. An invitation to leave a mark. Julian, unable to work, unable to rest, felt the strange, unfamiliar weight of responsibility settling upon him. He was drawn to the silent suite at the very top of his hotel, a magnetic pull he could not resist. He returned to his desk, picked up his phone, and once again sought refuge in action, in solving problems the only way he knew how. "Anya," he said to his assistant, his voice all business. "Compile a list of the city's most discreet grief counselors and contact an exclusive personal shopping service. I want a complete wardrobe portfolio curated for Miss Vance by morning. Bill everything directly and privately to me." He would throw resources at her pain, trying to manage it from a safe distance. Elara picked up the pen and notepad. The paper was thick and creamy, the pen cool and solid in her hand. For a moment she considered pouring out her anger, her sorrow, a letter to the man who had destroyed her. But that felt like a surrender. Instead, her innate sense of responsibility took over. She began to make a list, her handwriting shaky but clear. 1. Call Mom and Dad. Tell them I am safe. 2. Write a formal apology to the hotel management. 3. Find out how to begin repaying the costs of the cancellation. It was a small, defiant act of taking control in a situation where she had none. A testament to the strength that lay beneath her sorrow. And so the night passed. Below, in his office, a man of immense power tried to manage a stranger's heartbreak with his fortune. Above, in a gilded cage, a woman with a shattered heart tried to manage her new reality with her own quiet dignity and unwavering sense of duty. They were two isolated souls in a single building, separated by dozens of floors of concrete and steel, yet bound together by a single shared moment of vulnerability. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to break across the horizon, it illuminated the city and the beginning of what was supposed to have been her wedding day. The sun rose over the city, casting long shadows and painting the sky in cruel, beautiful shades of rose and gold. It was the dawn of her wedding day. From her vantage point in the sky, Elara watched the world awaken to a day that was supposed to have been the happiest of her life. With a trembling hand, she picked up her phone and completed the first task on her list, the one she dreaded the most. She took a deep, steadying breath. The silence of the penthouse a stark contrast to the storm of anxiety in her heart. And she dialed her mother's number. This call was her first tentative step out of the sanctuary of her grief and back into the waiting, complicated world. The conversation was everything she had feared. Her mother's voice, at first choked with overwhelming relief that she was safe, quickly escalated into a frantic barrage of loving but suffocating questions. "Where are you? Who is this man? You must come home to us, Elara. We will handle everything." Her family's love was a powerful tidal force, threatening to pull her under with their well-meaning intentions to fix, to fight, to wage a war on her behalf. But Elara didn't need a war. She needed a quiet harbor to repair her ship. She ended the call gently, her excuses vague, feeling the profound, aching loneliness of being completely misunderstood by those who loved her most. A short while later, a discreet chime sounded at the suite's entrance. A uniformed staff member, was there, leaving behind several large, elegant boutique boxes and a slim leather portfolio before vanishing as silently as he had appeared. With a sense of detached curiosity, Elara opened them. Inside was a complete, curated wardrobe of exquisite, understated clothing. Soft cashmere sweaters in shades of cream and gray, simple silk blouses, and perfectly tailored trousers. It was a costume for a new life, chosen by a stranger, paid for by the enigmatic Mr. Croft. The portfolio contained a list of the city's most exclusive grief counselors, their services pre-arranged and prepaid. A complex and conflicting wave of emotions washed over her. There was gratitude, of course, for the sheer, staggering generosity of the gesture, but it was tangled with a profound sense of discomfort. The beautiful clothes felt like an attempt to dress up her grief, to package it in something more presentable. The list of therapists, with their clinical specialties and hourly rates, felt like an attempt to schedule her healing, to solve it like a business problem. She knew he was trying to help, but his methods were as luxurious, cold, and impersonal as the suite itself. She didn't feel seen or understood. She felt managed down in his office. Julian received a concise, encrypted message from his head of security. Package delivered and received at 7:15. One outgoing call from the suite's landline at 6:48, duration 12 minutes. He was tracking her from a distance, gathering data as if she were a volatile stock he had just acquired. A familiar frustration pricked at him. He had provided her with the very best resources his immense wealth could procure, yet he knew, with a certainty that unnerved him, that these were blunt, inadequate instruments for such a delicate, intricate wound. He was a master of logistics, an emperor of efficiency. But in this new realm of human suffering, he felt like a clumsy, powerless amateur needing air. Elara discovered a set of glass doors that led to a private, wind-swept terrace. She stepped. Outside, the cool morning breeze a welcome touch of reality on her skin. She leaned against the railing, high above the awakening city. At that very moment, several floors below, Julian had stepped onto the private balcony adjoining his office, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He glanced up, a purely reflexive action, and froze. He saw her, a solitary figure against the vast morning sky. She did not see him. For a single charged moment, they were two lonely souls in their separate towers, sharing the same air. The same wounded morning. Julian retreated into the shadows of his office, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like an intruder, a voyeur spying on a private moment of grief. Seeing her there, not as a problem to be solved or a liability to be managed, but as a person simply enduring, reignited the fierce protective instinct he had felt in the garden. He was struck again by her profound dignity. She was not weeping, not pacing, not raging at the sky. She was simply standing, bearing the unbearable weight of her new reality. He found himself admiring her resilience, a quality he prized above all others, and was deeply unsettled by the force and sincerity of his admiration. Returning inside, Elara made a decision. She walked to the boxes of new clothes and chose a simple cream-colored cashmere sweater and gray trousers. The fabric was soft against her skin, a small, tangible comfort. Changing out of the silk robe, the last relic of her old life, was a quiet, symbolic act. It was an acceptance, not of defeat, but of a new, uncertain beginning. She looked at the portfolio of therapists, with their kind, professional faces, and set it aside. Not yet. Instead, she picked up the notepad and pen, her resolve firming. She would focus on what she could control, on the list she had made in the dark dot. With a clear head, she began to write. The letter was not long, but she chose her words with care. It was a formal, sincere apology addressed to the hotel's general manager. She expressed her deep regret for the disruption and inconvenience her personal tragedy had caused the hotel and its staff. She acknowledged the immense work that had been wasted and thanked them for their professionalism. There was no mention of her own pain, no hint of self-pity, only a quiet, dignified sense of responsibility. It was an act of reclaiming her own agency, of tidying up the wreckage piece by piece on her own terms. She used the suite's console to call the front desk, her voice calm and steady, requesting that someone come to collect a letter for the manager. The request was handled with the seamless efficiency she was coming to expect. The letter soon found its way from the general manager's desk to Julian's. He slit the envelope open and read her words, written in a neat, elegant script. He read it once and then again. This simple, selfless apology, written from the very epicenter of her own devastation, was the final, undeniable proof. This woman was a force of quiet strength, of profound grace. He held the paper, a tangible piece of her soul, and felt the last of his cynical armor begin to irrevocably crumble. If this story touched you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story from. Your support is what motivates us to keep bringing you romances that warm the heart. Julian sat in his office, the sheet of paper containing Elara's letter resting on the polished surface of his desk. It felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. Her words, so full of dignity and a sense of responsibility that defied. Her circumstances were a quiet revelation. They solidified a resolve that had been forming in the depths of his soul since their meeting in the garden. This was no longer about providing a temporary, passive shelter. It was about offering active, unwavering protection. He would not just be her sanctuary, he would be her shield. With a sense of finality, he carefully folded the letter and placed it inside a locked drawer, a private vow made to himself. The first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived in the form of his head of public relations, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Evelyn, whose composure was, for the first time Julian could recall, visibly shaken. She held a tablet displaying the early morning whispers from the city's most venomous gossip blogs. The Hamilton family, the clan of her former fiancé, was already spinning a vicious, self-serving narrative. They were not admitting to their son's cowardice. Instead, they were leaking hints to their social circles about Elara's supposed emotional instability, painting the wedding's cancellation as a tragic but necessary result of her unpredictable nature. A cold, dangerous fury ignited within Julian. It was the calculated cruelty of the attack, the attempt to assassinate the character of a woman already devastated, that he found so utterly contemptible. This was a tactic of the weak, a cowardly volley fired from the safety of their immense wealth. His orders to Evelyn were swift, precise, and absolute. "Kill it!" he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Use every contact, every lever of influence we have. I want a complete and total media blackout on Miss Vance's name. She is a private guest of this hotel, and I will consider any breach of her privacy a direct attack on me." But in a sleek, chrome and glass office across the city, his chief business rival was reading the same reports with a very different reaction. Cassandra Thorne, a woman whose ambition was matched only by her ruthlessness, saw not a tragedy, but a golden opportunity. She had been searching for a crack in Julian Croft's impenetrable armor for years, and here it was. The untouchable, emotionally detached titan of industry was harboring a beautiful, vulnerable, and jilted bride in his own private penthouse. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. The narrative wrote itself. A perfect story of power, seduction, and exploitation. Cassandra picked up her private phone, her movements fluid and deliberate. The person on the other end was a journalist known for his flexible ethics and his talent for sensationalism. Her voice, when she spoke, was a masterful performance of feigned concern. "I'm just so worried about Julian," she sighed, the sound like silk sliding over steel. "And this poor girl, Elara, to be so publicly humiliated and then immediately swept away by a man of his reputation, alone in his penthouse? It feels so opportunistic. I truly hope he has her best interests at heart, but one has to wonder, doesn't one? She had planted the venomous seeds, disguising her malice as virtuous anxiety. Despite Julian's formidable efforts to scrub the internet of the Hamiltons' gossip, Cassandra's story was a different kind of poison, and it found fertile ground. By midday, a major online tabloid had run the story, its headline a masterpiece of scandalous innuendo: "Billionaire hotelier Julian Croft comforts jilted bride in secret penthouse." The article was a tapestry of half-truths and clever speculation, painting Julian as a calculated predator and Elara as either a naive victim or, worse, a cunning gold digger who had quickly traded up. The private, quiet sanctuary Julian had offered was now the scene of a fictional, sordid crime. The PR nightmare had officially erupted. The article was sent to Julian's phone by his PR team. The fury he felt now was of a different nature. The Hamilton's pathetic gossip had been an attack on Elara. This, however, was an attack on his own character, using Elara as the weapon. The calculated cruelty, the carefully chosen words designed to inflict maximum damage to his reputation, it all bore the signature of one person: Cassandra Thorne. He knew, with an icy certainty, that this was her handiwork. The conflict had just escalated from a messy personal drama to an all-out corporate war. With Elara standing in the crossfire, he was now faced with a terrible, unavoidable decision. He could not shield Elara from this by keeping her in ignorance. The story was public, spreading like wildfire, and she had a right to know what was being said about her, about them. He dreaded the conversation more than any high-stakes negotiation he had ever entered. It meant intentionally piercing the fragile bubble of peace he had tried to create for her. It meant watching this new public humiliation inflict a fresh wound. He felt a profound sense of failure. His sanctuary had been breached, and the cruel, loud world had found her once again, with a heavy heart. He took the private elevator to the penthouse. This time, he did not enter unannounced. He pressed the button for the suite's intercom, the formal chime sounding alien in the space. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice strained. "It is Julian Croft. I must speak with you about an urgent and unfortunate matter." Through the speaker, he heard her grant him access. When the doors opened, she was standing in the middle of the vast living room, a fragile piece about her that he was about to shatter. He held a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with the toxic article. He walked towards her, the distance between them feeling like a mile. He decided that directness, however brutal, was the only option. He did not try to soften the blow or explain it away. He simply held out the tablet for her to see. Her eyes scanned the screen, first the headline, then the accompanying paparazzi photo of the hotel, and then the sordid, speculative text. He watched as every trace of color drained from her face, as the fragile peace in her eyes was replaced by a new, more profound kind of horror. Her private grief had been stolen, twisted, and sold to the world as a cheap, tawdry spectacle. She was no longer safe, and she knew it. The tablet felt impossibly heavy in Elara's hands before it slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering softly onto the plush carpet. The sound was obscene in the quiet room, a small, vulgar punctuation mark at the end of her world's second, final sentence. The first had been a private betrayal. This was a public execution. The words from the screen seemed to be burned onto her retinas, branding her not as a woman in mourning, but as a sordid spectacle for a hungry, faceless crowd. The beautiful, silent penthouse, her safe harbor, was suddenly filled with the loud, ugly jeers of the entire world, and she felt the crushing weight of its judgment fall upon her. Her gaze lifted from the fallen tablet to Julian's face. She saw the hard set of his jaw, the storm clouds gathering in his gray eyes. She knew he was braced for the fallout. for the tears, the anger, the accusations that his promise of sanctuary had failed. But her own horror was not for herself. In that moment, her pain was eclipsed by a new, more terrible feeling, a devastating, sickening guilt. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words catching in her throat as she took an involuntary step back. "What have I done to you? This is my fault. Your hotel, your reputation. I am so sorry." Her first, truest instinct was for the damage she had brought to his door. Julian was utterly poleaxed. Her reaction was so profoundly contrary to every cynical expectation he held about human nature that it left him momentarily speechless. He had anticipated a storm of emotion directed at him, at the world, at her ex-fiancé. Instead, her first thought was for him, for the collateral damage to his life and his business. This selfless, dignified response was a force he had no defense against. In that instant, she ceased to be a problem to be managed or a liability to be contained. She was a person of immense and noble character, and his protective instinct roared to life, solidifying into an unbreakable diamond-hard resolve. Seeing the grim reality of the situation, Elara's own resolve hardened, but in a desperate, self-sacrificing direction. She was the source of this poison, a contagion that was now infecting his pristine, ordered world. She could not allow it. "I have to leave," she said, her voice gaining a frantic strength. "Now. I can't stay here. I can't let them destroy you because of me. I'll go to my parents. I will disappear. Please, you have to let me go." It was her only logical move, to protect her protector by surgically removing herself from his life. It was an act of gratitude, a final, desperate attempt to contain the disaster she believed she had caused. No. The word was a physical barrier in the air between them, sharp, absolute, and unyielding. It was the first time his voice had been stripped of its cool authority, replaced by something raw and fiercely emotional. "You will do no such thing. Leaving now is precisely what they want. It is a confession. You will stay right here," he commanded, taking a deliberate step, closer, closing the distance between them. His presence was no longer just imposing. It was a fortress wall, a declaration of intent. "This is the safest place for you in the world right now, and I will not have you running from this fight. We will not run." As if to punctuate his statement, the sharp, insistent buzz of his phone cut through the tension. He glanced at the screen, his expression turning to granite. It was his head of security. He listened for a moment, his gaze fixed on Elara's pale face. The outside world was no longer whispering. It was shouting. "The paparazzi have found us," he said, his voice grim after ending the call. "Multiple news vans are setting up across the street. The main entrance is compromised." He didn't need to elaborate. The fortress was officially under siege, and the enemy was at the gates, baying for a story. The stark reality of his words rendered her plan to leave utterly impossible. She couldn't walk out the front door even if she wanted to. They were trapped, not just by the walls of the penthouse, but by a shared and very public enemy. In that moment of shared crisis, the last vestiges of professional distance between them evaporated, consumed by the raw, pressing intimacy of two soldiers in a trench. He was no longer Mr. Croft, the benevolent host, and she was no longer Miss Vance, the grateful guest. They were two people, standing together against a firestorm, and their survival was now intrinsically linked. Julian Croft's mind, a formidable strategic weapon, immediately shifted from defense to offense. "They want a war. We will give them one," he said, his voice low and intense. "My legal team will file a multi-million-dollar libel suit against that tabloid by noon. My PR team will draft a statement. We will not hide, and we will not apologize." He was in his element now, a general planning his campaign, but the territory was new. This wasn't about market share. It was about a person's honor. He turned to her, his gaze direct and piercing. "But I will not do it without you. Are you with me on this, Elara?" The sound of her first name on his lips was a quiet shock, a small but powerful signal that everything had changed. It made the alliance real, personal. She looked at this formidable, intimidating man who had been dragged into her personal nightmare and had chosen not to abandon her, but to stand and fight beside her. Amidst the swirling chaos of fear and violation, a fragile, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in the center of her chest, a feeling she thought she had lost forever. Trust. She lifted her chin, her own resolve returning like a rising tide. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'm with you, Julian." His name, spoken in her voice, sealed the pact. A silent, powerful understanding passed between them. They were no longer two strangers orbiting a shared trauma, but a unified force. They stood together, looking out the vast floor-to-ceiling window down at the city that was now holding them captive with its relentless scrutiny. The penthouse was no longer a lonely, gilded cage, but a command center, a war room in the sky. The nature of their relationship had been irrevocably forged in the fire of public scandal. The question was no longer about survival, but about how they would fight and win this battle together. The penthouse transformed from a sanctuary into a war room. Julian, with a phone pressed to his ear, moved with a lethal grace, his voice a low, sharp instrument as he issued a volley of commands to his legal team. He spoke of injunctions, of defamation, of overwhelming force. Elara watched him, mesmerized. She was seeing the full, formidable power of the man she had met in the garden, a titan of industry now deploying his entire arsenal not for profit or prestige, but in the fierce, unwavering defense of her honor. The sight was terrifying, awesome, and for the first time since her world had shattered, she felt the undeniable, reassuring sensation of not being alone in the fight over the next few days. The formal distance that had once separated them was completely erased by the necessities of their new alliance. They spent hours together with Julian's PR team, huddled over a large mahogany table, drafting and redrafting their official statement. They debated every word, every phrase, every subtle connotation, a process that forced an intimate and rapid understanding of each other's minds. The statement they released to the world was a masterpiece of dignified defiance. It refuted the salacious lies, affirmed Elara's position as an honored guest in need of privacy, and formally announced the multi-million-dollar lawsuit that was to come. As days bled into a week, and then two, the media siege continued relentlessly outside the hotel walls. But inside the penthouse, a strange and quiet peace began to take root. A new routine formed, one of shared meals and late-night conversations under the soft glow of the city lights. The initial talk of legal strategy slowly, naturally, gave way to more personal terrain. He spoke of the ambition that drove him, and she spoke of the simple dreams that had once driven her. They discovered the shared geography of their past, heartbreaks, the lonely landscapes they had both navigated. The vast, cold penthouse began to feel less like a cage and more like a home. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, a comfortable silence stretching between them, Elara found the courage to ask the question that had been hovering in her mind for weeks. "Why, Julian?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on his profile against the twilight sky. "Why are you doing all of this for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his usual armor of detachment momentarily gone. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a flicker of an old, deep pain. "Because I know what it's like," he said, his voice low, "to have your world stolen from you by a coward. I simply decided I have a zero-tolerance policy for it." His admission, though brief, was a profound gift of vulnerability, and it fueled Elara's own burgeoning strength. Focusing on their shared fight, gave her a purpose that extended beyond the horizon of her own grief. She was no longer just a victim, the poor abandoned bride of the headlines. She was a partner, a strategist, an active participant in her own defense. She provided Julian's legal team with invaluable insights into the Hamilton family's weaknesses, their vanities, their pressure points. The light of battle began to rekindle the spark in her eyes. She was not just healing. She was being forged into something stronger. Their defiance, however, only enraged their unseen enemies. Enraged by the lawsuit and the public's shifting sympathy, Cassandra Thorne escalated her shadow campaign. She leaked new, more vicious stories to her pet journalists, this time twisting Elara's grace into a narrative of cold calculation. Elara's heartfelt apology letter to the hotel was spun as a clever, manipulative ploy to ensnare a billionaire's sympathy. The attacks became more personal, more cruel, designed to methodically dismantle Elara's character and drive a poisonous wedge of doubt between her and her protector. Amidst this escalating war, the date for the Celestial Peaks Hotel's annual Starlight Charity Gala loomed. It was the city's premier philanthropic event, a night Julian had personally chaired for years and a cornerstone of his carefully cultivated public image. His advisors, led by a frantic Evelyn, strongly urged him to cancel or, at the very least, attend alone. The risk of a public scene was immense. The press would be there in full force, as would Cassandra Thorne, the Hamiltons, and every other vulture circling their story. It was a guaranteed media circus. Julian's first instinct was to agree, to keep Elara safely cloistered in the penthouse, shielded from the ugly glare of the spotlight. He presented the situation to her, carefully framing it as a matter of her safety, of sparing her the inevitable pain of that night. He was still her protector, her guardian, and his deepest impulse was to keep her behind the impenetrable walls of the sanctuary he had built for her. He was prepared to face the lions alone, a sacrifice he was more than willing to make to ensure that she remained untouched by the coming storm. But the woman who stood before him was not the same shattered soul he had found in the garden weeks ago. She listened to his concerns, her expression calm and resolute. When he was finished, she shook her head, a quiet but absolute refusal. "No, Julian," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a newfound confidence he had never heard before. "I am done hiding. They have painted me as a weak and manipulative victim for weeks. The only way to fight a lie that big is to stand in the light and show them the truth. I am going to that gala with you." Julian was stunned, silenced by the sheer force of her courage. He looked at her and saw not a fragile woman in need of his protection, but a queen, radiant and unbowed, ready to walk into the heart of her enemy's territory and face them on her own terms. A wave of profound, overwhelming admiration and something far deeper, far warmer, washed over him. The risks were colossal, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that she was right. A slow, genuine smile, the first she had ever truly seen, spread across his face. "All right," he said, his voice filled with a pride that startled them both. "Then we go together. Let them stare." The night of the Starlight Charity Gala arrived, a glittering affair held in the very same ballroom where Elara's wedding was meant to have been. As she and Julian made their entrance, a palpable hush fell over the opulent room. She was a vision, in a gown of deep emerald silk, a color of resilience and life. Her quiet elegance a stark contrast to the scarlet rumors that had surrounded her. Julian was at her side, a tuxedoed shadow of immense power and unwavering support. They moved as one, a united front of quiet defiance. And as they walked through the parted sea of the city's elite, the air crackled not with celebration, but with the electric, predatory tension of a spectacle about to begin. Elara could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on her, could hear the sibilant whispers that followed in their wake, like the rustle of dry leaves. She held on to Julian's arm, his strength her only anchor in the swirling vortex of judgment. Across the room, she saw her enemies assembled. Cassandra Thorne, draped in diamonds and smug satisfaction, watched them with a reptilian smile. A few tables away, Beatrice Hamilton, her former fiancé's sister, glared at her with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. The entire room felt like a beautifully decorated arena, and she and Julian were the gladiators, willingly walking into the center to face the lions. From her vantage point, Cassandra saw her moment arriving. Her plan was a masterpiece of social cruelty, designed to detonate in the most public way possible. With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, she caught Beatrice Hamilton's eye. She had spent the last week stoking the fires of the Hamilton family's misplaced pride, convincing the volatile, foolish young woman that a public confrontation was the only way to reclaim their family's honor. Beatrice, her face flushed with champagne and self-righteous fury, gave a sharp, affirmative nod. The trap was set. Cassandra leaned back in her chair, a connoisseur of chaos about to watch her art unfold. During a planned lull for guests to mingle before the main auction, Beatrice made her move. She strode to the low stage at the front of the ballroom, where a microphone stood ready for the evening's speeches. She snatched it from its stand, her movements jerky and aggressive. "Excuse me," she began, her voice shrill and amplified, instantly silencing the room. "I think there's something everyone here needs to know." She turned, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Elara. "That woman is a fraud, a manipulative gold digger who planned this all along, faking a broken heart to trade my brother for a billionaire." The press, perfectly positioned by Cassandra, surged forward. A blinding constellation of flashing cameras. The vicious, public accusation struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. The sudden cacophony of shouting reporters, the blinding flash of camera bulbs, the hundreds of accusing and curious eyes all converged on her. The grand ballroom seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and suffocating. Her newfound strength, so carefully nurtured over the past weeks, shattered like glass. The sounds of the room faded to a dull roar, and for one terrifying, paralyzing moment, she was no longer at a gala. She was back on that cold stone bench in the garden, utterly alone, her world collapsing into an inescapable, silent darkness. Julian felt the sudden, violent tremor in her hand as it gripped his arm, felt the life and fight drain out of her. He saw the blank, terrified look in her eyes and knew she was gone, lost in the vortex of her trauma. In that crystalline moment of decision, every cynical, protective instinct he had ever harbored screamed at him to get her out of there, to shield her, to retreat back to the safety of the penthouse. But as he looked at her beautiful, frozen face, he understood a more profound truth. The only way to truly save her was not to hide her from the fire, but to walk into it with her and, for the first time in his life, expose his own scars to the light. Gently, he squeezed her hand. A silent promise before releasing her. With a calm, deliberate purpose that defied the chaos swirling around them, he walked onto the stage. He did not rush, did not shout. He simply took the second microphone from the podium, his presence so commanding, so absolute, that the entire room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The reporters lowered their cameras. Beatrice Hamilton's tirade died in her throat. The king was in his castle, and he was about to hold court. He ignored the sputtering woman beside him and the sea of faces before him, his entire being focused on one singular transformative purpose. He did not begin by defending Elara. He began with a confession that would stun the city for years to come. "Many of you in this room know me as a businessman," he said, his voice deep, clear, and resonant, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "You see this hotel, this empire I have built, and you see it as a monument to success. You are wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This is not a monument. It is a fortress. A fortress I began building more than a decade ago. On the night my own fiancé left me for my business partner, leaving me publicly humiliated and privately broken." A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. The untouchable Julian Croft was showing them his deepest wound. Then, he turned his gaze from the stunned crowd and fixed it entirely on Elara. She was staring at him, the frozen terror in her eyes slowly melting away, replaced by a dawning, disbelieving comprehension. "I spent 10 years of my life building walls," he continued, his voice softening, becoming an intimate conversation in a room full of people. "I believed that true strength was about control, about never allowing myself to feel that kind of pain again. Then I met a woman who, in the face of that same cruelty, showed me what real strength is. Her grace, her dignity, her unwavering empathy for others, even when her own world was ending. Elara's courage taught me that strength isn't about building walls. It is about having the courage to feel." He set the microphone down and walked off the stage, moving directly to her side, his eyes never leaving hers. The world seemed to dissolve, leaving only the two of them in a single, brilliant spotlight of truth. He reached for her hand, his touch warm, firm, and grounding. Looking directly into her soul so that the entire world could bear witness, he made his final, transformative declaration. "This hotel was built with a broken heart," he said, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before, an emotion that was pure and true. "You, Elara Vance, have taught me that it can be a home." He lifted her hand to his lips, a public vow, a final stunning victory over the ghosts of their past. In the vast ballroom, a stunned silence followed Julian's words, a collective breath held by the city's elite. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. The sound was quickly joined by another and another, until a wave of heartfelt, thunderous applause washed through the room. It was not a polite, obligatory ovation. It was a genuine, emotional endorsement of the raw truth they had just witnessed. Beatrice Hamilton stood frozen on the stage, a statue of public humiliation, while across the room, Cassandra Thorne's face was a mask of cold, impotent fury. Her perfectly orchestrated execution had become his coronation. Julian, holding Elara's hand tightly, led her through the parting crowd, their shared vulnerability now their most impenetrable shield. They rode the private elevator back to the penthouse in a profound, comfortable silence. The air between them was no longer charged with tension or uncertainty, but with the quiet, powerful hum of a truth finally spoken. When the doors slid open into the suite that had been her sanctuary, her war room, and now finally her home, Julian turned to face her. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, his gaze searching hers with an expression of pure, unguarded tenderness. All the walls were gone, all the fortresses dismantled. In the quiet of the penthouse, their public declaration was sealed with a private, unspoken understanding that was more powerful than any vow. The aftermath of the gala was swift and decisive. The story of Julian's speech and Elara's quiet dignity became the city's new legend. The tabloid that had slandered them printed a groveling front-page retraction and settled the lawsuit for an astronomical sum. Cassandra Thorne's vicious tactics were exposed, leaving her reputation in tatters, a pariah in the very circles she sought to dominate. The Hamilton family, disgraced and humiliated, retreated from public life entirely. Julian and Elara had not just weathered the storm. They had stood in its eye and commanded the winds to change, emerging not as victims, but as victors in a story of their own making. Weeks later, in the hotel's main boardroom, Elara stood before a small group, her voice filled with a new, quiet passion. She proposed an idea: to take the substantial sum of money from the lawsuit, along with the funds that had been allocated for her canceled wedding, and give it a new purpose. She pitched the creation of the Vance Foundation, a charity dedicated to providing immediate financial and emotional support for individuals blindsided by sudden, life-altering events. Julian watched her, his heart swelling with a love and pride so immense it nearly overwhelmed him. When she finished, he simply said, "I will personally match every dollar." The Celestial Peaks Hotel, once a monument to one man's lonely ambition, began to transform. It became the headquarters for the foundation, its gilded halls now filled with a new sense of purpose and compassion. Elara, as the foundation's director, thrived. Her profound empathy, once a source of private pain, was now her greatest professional asset, a beacon of hope for others lost in the dark. The hotel was no longer just a stage for perfect planned fairy tales. It had become a real-life sanctuary for healing, a place where broken pieces were gathered and made whole again. Julian himself was the most transformed of all. The cold, ruthless titan of industry was gone, replaced by a man who led with compassion and valued human connection above all else. The icy gray of his eyes had thawed, revealing a deep, warm, and constant light that was reserved only for Elara. He spent less time poring over spreadsheets in his office and more time by her side, an active partner in the beautiful, meaningful world they were building together. He had spent a decade building a fortress to keep love out, only to learn from her that true strength was in having the courage to let it in. 2 years later, the hotel garden was once again decorated for a wedding. But this time, there was no pretense, no lavish spectacle. An intimate gathering of their closest friends and family stood under an archway of white roses and wild jasmine. The place that had once been the scene of Elara's most profound despair was now the stage for her greatest joy, a testament to the healing power of time and love. The circle was complete. The ground where their story began, a place of shadows and secrets, was now a place of sunlight and sacred vows. Elara, radiant in a simple, elegant gown, walked towards the man waiting for her. The Julian who stood there was a world away from the cold, stern figure she had first met on that stone bench. The love and adoration that shone from his eyes was a universe of warmth, a home she had never expected to find. As they exchanged their vows, the words were more than just promises for a future. They were a quiet, grateful acknowledgement of the broken road that had, against all odds, led them to each other, proving that the deepest scars can often form the truest maps. Among the small party of guests, a confident, smiling young woman was discreetly coordinating with the staff. She was one of the first people the Vance Foundation had helped, a young woman abandoned on the eve of her own wedding, lost and hopeless. Today, she was the hotel's most promising new event planner, her life rebuilt with the help of the couple now saying, "I do." She caught Elara's eye and gave a small, grateful nod. She was the living, breathing testament to the beautiful, ever-expanding ripple effect of their love, a story of hope that would now create others. Later that evening, as husband and wife, Julian and Elara sat together on the familiar stone bench, the stars bright in the night sky above them. He took her hand, his touch as comforting and essential as breathing. "Are you happy, Elara Croft?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full and at peace, and looked up at the infinite, glittering darkness. "My world," she replied softly, "has never been brighter." They sat in the quiet of the garden, two souls who had found each other in the dark, now and forever, a home. If you like this video, please subscribe and leave a like. And if you watched until the very end, let us know by commenting with the keyword "a home" so we know you made it. Thank you for being part of our story.